Penelope Smith clawed her fingers into the frozen earth and screamed, not for help, not for God, but for the man whose letters she had memorized like scripture, whose handwriting she knew better than her own heartbeat. She screamed Samuel's name until her voice broke, and the blizzard swallowed the sound whole, until there was nothing left of her voice, nothing left of the road, nothing left of the world she had crossed half a continent to reach. Then the cold took her legs and she went down. If this story already has your heart, don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The last letter Samuel Holloway ever sent to Penelope Smith arrived on a Tuesday in October, and she read it so many times the paper went soft along the folds. "I am not a man of grand words, Miss Smith," he had written, "but I am a man of my word. Come to Fairplay by December, and I will have a fire burning, and a life waiting." She had pressed that letter against her chest and made her decision in the space of a single breath. That was 10 weeks ago. Now the letter was tucked inside her coat, pressed against her ribs, soaked through with sweat and melting snow. And Penelope Smith was on her hands and knees in the middle of a Colorado mountain pass with no road beneath her and no light ahead, and no voice left in her throat to call for anyone. She had been walking for 2 hours, maybe 3. She had stopped counting when her feet stopped feeling. The stagecoach had broken an axle half a mile back, or what she believed was half a mile, though distances had a way of dissolving in a blizzard. The driver, a thick-armed man named Connors, had cursed the wheel and cursed the weather, and then turned to his 4 passengers, with the look of a man delivering a verdict rather than an apology. "Ain't going nowhere tonight," he said. "Best stay put and wait her out." The other passengers, a traveling merchant and his wife from Denver, and an elderly minister wrapped in a traveling cloak, had agreed immediately, huddling together inside the tilted coach with a shared blanket and a shared silence. Penelope had sat with them for 20 minutes. Then she couldn't anymore. "Fairplay can't be more than 2-3 miles east," she said, pulling on her gloves. "There must be shelter, a ranch, a way station, something." "Miss." Connors looked at her with the flat patience of a man who had survived long enough to recognize which battles weren't worth fighting. "The last woman I knew who walked into a storm like this, they found her in April." "I appreciate your concern," Penelope said, and pushed the door open. The cold hit her like a wall of iron. She heard the merchant's wife gasp behind her, and heard Connors mutter something under his breath that she chose not to hear, and then the door swung shut, and she was alone in the white. She had grown up in Boston. She understood cold. She understood snow. What she had not understood, what no amount of Boston winters could have prepared her for, was the particular cruelty of a Colorado mountain blizzard, which was not simply cold and snow, but something alive, something with intention, something that seemed to push against her from every direction at once, as though the mountain itself had decided she had no business being there. She walked east, or what she believed was east. She walked with her head down and her arms crossed over her chest, and Samuel's letter against her heart. And she thought about his handwriting, the careful loops of his capital letters, the way he always signed his name with a slight slant, as though even his signature was leaning toward something. "Come to Fairplay by December, and I will have a fire burning." She had come. She was here. She just needed to find the fire. The wind shifted and she stumbled, catching herself on one knee. The snow beneath her was past her ankle, past her shin in places. She pushed herself up and kept walking, and the cold moved into her hands despite the gloves moved past the wool and settled into the knuckles with a dull, spreading ache that she tried to ignore. She thought about her mother who had cried at the train station in Boston and pressed Penelope's face between both palms and said, "You are the bravest fool I have ever loved." She thought about her sister, who had made her promise to write every week and to describe the mountains in detail because she'd never seen a real mountain in her life. She thought about the stack of letters she kept tied with twine in the bottom of her trunk. Samuel's letters, 12 of them, one for each month of their correspondence, and how she had fallen in love with a man's mind long before she had ever looked upon his face. She had not told anyone that. It wasn't the sort of thing a sensible woman from Boston admitted out loud. But the letters had done something to her. The way he wrote about the land, not romantically, not with any of the flowery excess that other men put into correspondence, but plainly, honestly, the way a man describes something he genuinely loves. The grass here in spring is something you have to see, to believe, Miss Smith. It goes on so long it looks like the earth is breathing. The way he had answered her questions about the ranch with patience and specificity, never condescending, always treating her like a woman capable of understanding the realities of frontier life. The way he had signed his very first letter, "Respectfully yours," though I confess I hope one day to be yours less respectfully. That line had made her laugh out loud, alone in her boarding house room, and she had covered her mouth with her hand and felt something warm move through her chest that had no business being there given the circumstances. She had been corresponding with a stranger. She had agreed to marry him. She was an educated woman, a trained bookkeeper who had managed the accounts for 2 separate firms in Boston, a woman who prided herself on rational decisions supported by evidence. And yet here she was walking into a blizzard in the Colorado mountains to marry a man she had never touched. The rational part of her brain pointed out that this was not particularly rational. The rest of her told the rational part to be quiet. She didn't know exactly when she fell. One moment she was walking, and the next she was horizontal face against the snow. And for a long, terrible moment she simply lay there and felt the cold pressing into her cheek, like a hand. She tried to push herself up. Her arms shook. She got to one knee, then both knees, then stood, and then the wind came again savage and sideways, and she went down hard. This time, she didn't try to get up immediately. This is foolish, she thought, with the strange clarity that comes when fear has burned itself out and left something quieter in its place. This is genuinely, irretrievably foolish. "Samuel," she said out loud, though her voice was barely a sound anymore. "I am going to be very cross with you when I arrive." She pressed her forehead against her arm and breathed. She did not hear the horse. The wind was too loud for that. What she heard or believed she heard in the moment before everything went white was a voice. A man's voice, low and urgent, saying something she couldn't make out, and then hands large, certain hands gripping her by the shoulders and lifting. She said or tried to say, "I can walk." The hands didn't listen. Miles Holloway had been awake since 4 in the morning. This was not unusual. He was a man who slept poorly by habit and efficiently by necessity, 4 hours 5 if the season allowed enough to keep the body functional without wasting the dark. But that particular morning, the unease that had dragged him out of sleep was not the ordinary unease of ranch work and weather worries. It was something else. Something that sat behind his sternum and pressed. The stagecoach from Denver was supposed to have arrived by 8 the previous evening. He'd known it was late by 9. He'd known something was wrong by 10. By midnight, with the storm rattling the window frames and Tim, his ranch hand, a compact, capable man of 40, who had seen enough to be suspicious of optimism, telling him there was no sense going out until daylight, Miles had made himself sit down in the chair by the fire and wait. He had lasted until 2. "You are the stubbornest man I have ever worked for," Tim said, watching him pull on his second coat. "And I worked for Hector Grimes for 6 years. God rest his impossible soul." "Stay here," Miles said. "Keep the fire going. The fire's going to do a lot of good when they're bringing you back frozen. I'll take Thunder. He knows the road better than I do." "Miles." Tim stepped in front of him, which was a thing Tim rarely did. He was a man who chose his battles carefully, and the fact that he was choosing this one meant something. "Listen to me. The girl is either sheltering in the coach or she isn't. If she is, she'll keep till morning. If she isn't—" He stopped. Let the if hang there. Miles looked at him for a long moment. "You know I can't wait till morning." Tim sighed, the sigh of a man who had already known this and was simply performing the ritual of resistance because it was the right thing to do. "Take the extra rope," he said, "and the flask. Not for you, for her if you find her." Miles took both. He had known or suspected or allowed himself something that was not quite knowing, but was not quite not knowing either, that Penelope Smith was not an ordinary woman. A year of letters would tell you a great deal about a person if you were paying attention, and Miles had paid attention. The precision of her thinking, the dry, understated humor that appeared in her third letter and never quite left. The way she asked questions, not tentative questions, not questions designed to seem interested, but genuinely investigative questions, the kind a person asks when they actually want the answer. She had asked him in her 7th letter about the accounting systems he used for the ranch. Not in a polite way. In a detailed, technical way that had made him set the letter down and read it again. She had then, in a subsequent letter, identified 3 inefficiencies in his record-keeping based purely on his description of his methods and offered corrections so precise and practical that he had implemented all 3 within a week. He had not told Samuel about that letter. He had not told Samuel about most of the later letters if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be whenever possible, even when honesty was inconvenient. He rode thunder into the storm and told himself he was doing what any decent man would do. A woman was lost in a blizzard. You went and found her. That was the plain, simple truth of the situation, and he did not need to examine it more carefully than that. Thunder moved with the careful, deliberate trust of a horse who understood bad weather and had opinions about it, but was ultimately loyal enough to override them. Miles kept his head down, his eyes scanning what little he could see through the driving white. He had a lantern hanging from the saddle horn, though it didn't do much against the dark and the storm, more for finding than for seeing something to catch the edge of. He almost missed her. He would think about that later in the strange, slow hours of the night, how close he had come to riding past. How if thunder hadn't shied slightly to the left, if the lantern hadn't swung at exactly that moment, if the wind hadn't briefly dropped its howl by a single degree, he might have been 20 yards past her before he knew it. But the lantern caught something. A shape in the snow that wasn't adrift. He was off Thunder before the horse had fully stopped sliding down into the snow and crossing the distance in a few fast strides, and then he was on his knees beside her, and his hands were already moving, turning her over, pushing the snow-caked hair from her face. She was pale as paper. Her lips had gone the color of a winter sky. But she was breathing short, shallow, barely there breathing, but breathing, and when his hands gripped her shoulders, she made a sound something between a word and a moan. "I can walk," she said, or tried to say. What came out was closer to "I can wah" before the sound failed. "No, ma'am," Miles said. "You cannot." "Ooh." He got her up. She was not a small woman, taller than he'd expected, and solid, the build of someone who had done actual work in her life, despite the Boston address, and she was dead weight, her legs refusing to cooperate in any meaningful way. But he got an arm under her knees, and an arm under her shoulders, and lifted her against his chest and stood. She said something else. He couldn't make it out. "What's that?" he said, leaning down. "Samuel." Her voice was almost nothing. "Tell Samuel I wasn't. She didn't finish the sentence. He wasn't sure she was fully conscious by the end of it. He held her against him with one arm, grabbed Thunder's reins with the other, and turned back toward the ranch. "Easy," he said to the horse, or to the woman, or to himself. It was unclear. "Easy now. We're going home." Tim had the door open before Miles reached it. He didn't ask questions, just stepped back and held the door, and then immediately went for more blankets, while Miles carried Penelope through and set her as gently as he could manage in the chair closest to the fire. Her hands were white at the fingertips. Her coat was soaked through entirely. Miles started with the coat, working the buttons with fingers that were not entirely steady, and Tim appeared at his shoulder with a blanket and the pragmatic expression of a man who had done field medicine before and had no time for squeamishness. "How long?" Tim asked. She was walking, maybe 2 hours in it, maybe more. Tim made a sound that was not quite a word. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, counting. "Pulse is there. Weak." "I know. Frostbite on the fingers. Maybe the toes. We won't know till she warms up." "I know Tim." Tim looked at him sideways. "You know her?" Miles didn't answer that immediately. He was working on her boots, which were laced and frozen and stubborn, and he focused on that for a moment with more attention than strictly necessary. "We've corresponded," he said finally. Tim was quiet for a moment. Then, "This is Samuel's girl." It was not a question. "Yes," Miles said. Another silence. Tim handed him a second blanket without comment, which was Miles had always thought one of Tim's better qualities. He knew which silences were for talking into and which ones weren't. They worked steadily, and the fire did its work, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, and then, with gathering confidence, the color began to come back into Penelope Smith's face. The white at her fingertips faded to pink, then to red, and she made a sharp, involuntary sound that meant the feeling was returning. And Miles said, I know it hurts. That's good. That means it's working." She didn't respond to that, but some tension in her face eased slightly, which he took as acknowledgement. He did not sleep. Tim made coffee and set a cup on the hearth, and eventually took himself off to the bunkhouse with the particular tact of a man who understood when his presence was no longer required. Miles sat in the chair across from her and watched the fire and listened to her breathing, even out. Watched it deepen and slow into something that was actual sleep rather than unconsciousness, and felt the coil of fear in his chest begin slowly, reluctantly to loosen. He looked at her face. He had not let himself do that exactly during the rescue. There was no room for anything except function when you were pulling someone out of a blizzard. But now in the firelight, with the storm still raging against the walls and the rest of the world reduced to this room and this fire and this woman, he allowed himself a moment. She looked exactly like her letters. He couldn't have explained that to anyone because it was a strange and possibly irrational thing to think. But it was true. The particular set of her jaw, even in sleep, the line of her, the quiet stubbornness of her. She looked like a woman who had decided to walk into a blizzard, and had not been wrong about her ability to do it. She had simply been wrong about the blizzard. He thought about Samuel. He thought about the letter he was going to have to write in the morning to Fairplay to his cousin's ranch hand, who was holding things together in Samuel's absence, asking him to ride out and check for survivors from the stagecoach. He thought about the conversation that was coming when this woman woke up, and what he was going to say, and in what order, and how to say the one particular thing that sat heaviest in him without saying it wrong. He thought about her voice in the snow. "Tell Samuel I wasn't what? Wasn't afraid. Wasn't sorry. Wasn't going to give up." He didn't know. He thought, knowing what he knew about her from 12 months of letters, that it could have been any of those things. He thought it could have been all of them. He reached across and pulled the second blanket up more firmly around her shoulders, and she shifted slightly in sleep and didn't wake. Outside, the storm went on. Inside, the fire held. Miles Holloway sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling and thought about the particular cruelty of timing, how a man could do everything right, answer every letter, honestly, keep every promise he made to himself, wait with patience and with hope, and still find himself sitting in the wrong chair, in the wrong cabin, watching the wrong woman sleep. Not the wrong woman. He corrected himself immediately with the firmness of a man who knew the difference between what he was thinking and what he ought to be thinking. Samuel's woman. That was the accurate term. Samuel's woman, who was alive because Miles had ridden out into a blizzard and found her, and who would recover, and who would in due course make her way to Fairplay and to the life that had been arranged, and Miles would return to his ranch and his cattle and his 4 hours of sleep a night, and his letters, except there would be no more letters because there was no longer any need for them. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the edge of the last letter he had received from her 3 weeks ago before he'd known she was already on the road. He had not told her he'd kept all of them. He had kept them in a tin box under the floorboard beneath his bed, which was the kind of thing a man did when he knew on some level that he was keeping something he had no right to keep. "Mr. Holloway," she had written in that last letter, "I confess I am more nervous about this journey than I expected to be. Not about the destination, about the distance between who I am here and who I will be required to be there. Do you think it is possible to carry your whole self across that kind of distance? Or does some part of you always stay behind?" He had read that letter 4 times before he wrote back. He had drafted 3 different responses and discarded all of them before settling on the one he sent, which was honest but careful, which answered her question without answering too much of it. "I think the part of yourself that stays behind," he had written, "is usually the part you are ready to leave. The parts that matter have a way of making the journey." She had written back 2 days later with a single line, "I am choosing to find that comforting." He pressed his thumb against the folded edge of the letter and looked at her sleeping face, and allowed himself, just for that one unguarded moment in the firelit dark, to find it comforting too. Then he folded that moment away, the way a man folds something he has no use for, but cannot quite bring himself to discard, and settled back in his chair and waited for morning. The fire cracked and settled. Penelope Smith breathed. The storm threw itself against the walls of the cabin with everything it had, and the walls held, and the warmth stayed. And somewhere east of them, in the direction she had been walking before, the cold took her down. The first gray edge of dawn was beginning slow and uncertain to find its way through. She woke up fighting. Not dramatically, not with a gasp and a scream the way women in penny novels woke from near death. She woke the way a person wakes when their body has decided it is done. Being unconscious and is resuming operations, whether the mind is ready or not. Her hand shot out and grabbed the arm of the chair, and she sat up hard, and the blankets fell away, and the fire hit her face like a wall of warmth, and she said very clearly, "I need to check the axle." Miles was on his feet before he'd made a conscious decision to stand. "Ma'am." "The axle," she said again, turning toward the voice, and then she saw him and stopped. He watched her process it, watched her eyes move around the room, back to the fire, down to the blankets pooled in her lap, back to him. He could see her cataloging, sorting the way a precise mind handles unexpected data. He had seen that quality in her letters, the way she never panicked, just organized, and here it was in person, in the flesh, and it was exactly what he'd imagined, and nothing like it at the same time. "The stagecoach," she said, quieter now. "The axle broke." "Yes, ma'am." "I was walking." "You were." "And then," she pressed 2 fingers to her temple, "you found me." "I did." She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, serious eyes. Then she said, "You're not Samuel." It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. "No, ma'am. I'm Miles Holloway, Samuel's cousin." Something moved through her face that he couldn't fully read. It wasn't disappointment exactly, or not only that. It was more complex than disappointment. It was the face of a woman recalculating a situation she had believed she understood. "Samuel sent you," she said. Miles took a breath, set it down carefully in his chest. "Samuel asked me to meet the stage. He had business to attend to at the ranch." He paused. "I'll explain it all proper, once you've had something hot to eat, and your feet are feeling like your feet again." She looked at him steadily for 3 full seconds. Then, "My feet feel like they belong to someone considerably less sensible than myself." Despite everything, he almost smiled. "That's the feeling coming back. It'll be unpleasant for a bit." "Wonderful." She pulled the blanket back up, which he had been waiting for her to do, had been carefully not looking at the state of her outer clothing, in the way a decent man maintains careful not looking in certain circumstances. She noticed his noticing, and her chin came up precisely 1/2 an inch, which told him she had registered the situation and was filing it under already handled "do not discuss." He liked that about her, he thought. And then he told himself to stop. "The other passengers," she said, "from the coach." Tim rode out at first light. The merchant and his wife were sheltering inside, cold but fine. The minister, too. Connors had the horses. They're all accounted for. She let out a breath that she had apparently been holding since she woke up. "Good. That's good." Then, "Mr. Holloway, how long was I out there?" "I found you around 3 in the morning. You've been here since." She looked toward the window at the pale gray light pressing through. "What time is it now?" "Going on 9. 6 hours." She absorbed this. "And Samuel's ranch how far?" "Fairplay's about 4 miles east. Samuel's spread is another 2 past town." 6 miles, she said almost to herself. Then she looked at him with something that was not quite suspicion, but was adjacent to it. "And you rode 4 miles into that storm, in the middle of the night, for a woman you'd never met." He met her eyes. "I'd have done it for anyone." She studied him the way she studied things directly without pretense. "That tells me something about you, Mr. Holloway." "What's that?" "That you're either extraordinarily decent or extraordinarily reckless. My mother, he said, held that those two things were the same. This time something softened around her mouth. Not a smile, but the shape that comes before one. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. He turned toward the small table by the wall where Tim had left biscuits and the coffee tin. Can you eat? I can do considerably more than eat, Penelope said, and began to push herself upright. Her legs gave out the instant she put weight on them. He was across the room in 4 steps and had her by both arms before she'd fully registered falling, and for one suspended terrible, deeply inconvenient moment, she was against his chest, with her hands gripping his forearms, and his face 3 inches from hers, and neither of them moved. Then she said with magnificent composure, I appear to be temporarily dependent on your assistance. Appears that way, he said. I want you to know that this is not representative of my general capabilities. I had no doubt. Good. She straightened and he steadied her, and she took 2 experimental steps on her own before she was satisfied enough to accept his arm for the remaining distance to the table. She sat. She drank half the coffee before it had properly cooled. She ate 2 biscuits with the focused efficiency of a woman who had decided that eating was a task to be completed so that she could move on to more pressing tasks. And then she set her cup down and said, Now, tell me about Samuel. Miles wrapped his hands around his own cup, looked at the table. He stopped, started again. He's a good man, works hard. The ranch is doing well, better than when he first started. He's grown it considerably. All of this was true. He focused on the true parts. He's looking forward to meeting you. She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her listening to what he wasn't saying. But, she said, I didn't say but, Mr. Holloway. Her voice was patient and precise, the voice of a woman who has spent years listening to men talk around things. I am a bookkeeper by training. I have spent the better part of a decade reading the spaces between numbers to find where money has gone missing. I am very good at detecting omissions. She tilted her head slightly. There's a but in there. I can hear it. He looked up at her. She looked back at him without flinching. He'll explain things himself when you're well enough to travel, Miles said. It's not my place. And if I'm asking you to make it your place, then I'd say that some things need to be said by the person they belong to. Another silence. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the last of the storm was running itself out. The wind had dropped to something sullen and occasional, which meant the worst was over. All right, Penelope said finally. She picked up her coffee cup again, turned it in her hands. Then let's talk about the letters. He went very still. 12 letters, she said. 1 a month, starting last January. She kept her eyes on the cup. I have them in my trunk. I reread them on the train. I've read them well. More times than is perhaps entirely dignified. She paused. They're very good letters, Mr. Holloway. He said nothing. The kind of letters that make a person feel known, she continued. Her voice was still even, but something under it had gone careful, deliberate. Which is an unusual thing to feel about correspondence with someone you've never met. I kept trying to understand it. I thought perhaps I was projecting, reading things into the words that weren't there. She set the cup down, looked at him directly. But they were there. Every time I reread them, they were still there. Miles set his own cup down with a steadiness that cost him something. Miss Smith, he asked you to write them, she said. Didn't he? The word no formed itself in his throat. He didn't say it because it wasn't true, and because she would know immediately that it wasn't true, and because whatever else he was not a man who looked a woman in the eye and lied. The silence went on for 4 full seconds, and then it told her everything she needed to know. She stood up slowly, carefully bracing against the table's edge, but upright, both feet under her. Samuel can't write, she said. Not a question. She had already assembled the answer. Or he reads poorly, and he needed someone to handle the correspondence. And you... She stopped. Her hand gripped the table edge. You wrote to me. For a year. Every word I read, every word I answered, That was you. Miss Smith. Every single letter. Her voice had gone very quiet, which was, he had come to understand through 12 months of correspondence, considerably more dangerous than if she'd raised it. The letter where you wrote about the spring grass. The letter where you told me where you wrote that. She stopped again, pressed her lips together. That was you. Yes, Miles said. The word came out rough. It was. She turned away from him, put both hands on the table, and looked at the fire. He watched her back, watched her breathe, watched her work through it. The way she worked through everything with a ferocious internal precision that she maintained, even when the rest of her was shaking. And she was shaking. He could see it in her shoulders, though he would not have said so out loud for anything in the world. Did Samuel know, she asked, what you were writing? He knew the shape of it. The practical parts where the ranch was, what the work was like, what to expect from the winters. The rest, he stopped, made himself say it straight. He left that to my judgment. Your judgment. She turned back around to face him, and her eyes were bright and angry, and something else beneath the anger that he couldn't name and didn't dare try. You wrote to a woman you'd never met. You answered her questions about the mountains and the cattle and the accounting records. You wrote. Her voice cracked just once, just at the edge of the word, and then she pulled it back. You wrote that the parts of yourself that matter make the journey. He hadn't known she was going to say that. He felt it land somewhere in the center of him, like a stone dropped into water. Yes, he said again. One syllable. The only honest thing he had left. She stared at him. He held her gaze because she deserved that much, because looking away would have been the coward's exit, and he had made himself a promise somewhere in the dark hours of the night while he sat watching the fire and watching her breathe. That when this moment came, he would take it standing up. Who are you? She asked. And it wasn't a simple question. He could hear all the layers of it. Who are you to have done this? Who are you that knew me before I knew you? Who are you that pulled me out of a blizzard and sat up all night and wrote me letters for a year and never once said your own name? I'm the man who found you in the snow, he said. Right now, that's all I can honestly claim to be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat back down heavily, not from weakness, but from the weight of the thing she was thinking. I want to see him, she said. Samuel, I want to hear it from him directly. I'll take you to Fairplay as soon as the road clears. Today. Miss Smith, you nearly froze to death last night. I am aware of that, Mr. Holloway. I was there. Her eyes met his, and the anger in them had banked slightly, not gone but steadier now, like coals rather than flame. I did not come 2,000 miles to sit in a stranger's cabin sorting through my feelings. I came here to meet the man I agreed to marry and to look him in the face and decide. I'd like to do that. Today. He held her gaze, then he nodded. Roads'll be passable by midday. Then we leave at midday. She pulled the blanket back over her lap with the particular decisiveness of a woman closing a subject. In the meantime, I'd like my trunk if Tim retrieved it from the coach, and I'd like to know I need to know. She stopped. Something crossed her face that was not anger anymore, that was raw and more difficult to look at directly. Was any of it real, the things you wrote? Or was it a performance, something you constructed, because Samuel needed a wife, and you were competent enough to produce one? The question sat between them. Miles looked at the table, looked at his hands, looked up at her. No part of it was performance, he said. She looked at him a long time after that. Something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way ice shifts at the first edge of a thaw, not broken, not open, but changed. The structure altered somewhere deep, where you couldn't quite see it. All right, she said softly. All right. He got up and went to find her trunk. She sat by the fire and opened her hands in her lap and looked at them. The redness at the fingertips where the cold had bitten in, the slight tremor that was either cold or emotion, or both. And she thought about 12 months of letters, and one night in a blizzard, and a man who had ridden out into the dark to find her, and had not yet, not once told her a single lie. Which was not nothing. She was not sure what it was exactly, But it was not nothing. The fire held. The storm outside made one last effort and fell quiet. And somewhere in the direction of Fairplay, 4 miles east through the clearing cold, a man named Samuel Holloway was going about his morning and did not yet know that the woman he had promised to marry was sitting in his cousin's chair, alive and warm, and asking questions that were going to change everything. Tim saddled the horses without comment, which was the most useful thing a person could do in a situation that had too many words already in it. Penelope came out of the cabin in a clean dress from her trunk, her hair pinned back with the particular neatness of a woman who uses order as armor. She had not asked Miles for help with anything after he'd brought the trunk in. She had taken it behind the curtain Tim had rigged without being asked, and when she came back out, she looked like herself again, composed, straight-backed, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and made them rearrange themselves around her without raising her voice. Miles held the horse for her. She mounted without assistance, which he had expected. They rode toward Fairplay in a silence that had more texture to it than most conversations. After a quarter mile, she said without looking at him, "How long have you known Samuel?" "All my life. We grew up together. His father and my father were brothers." "And you're close?" "We were." A pause. "We are. It's complicated the way family is complicated." She turned to look at him, then just briefly, "That's the most honest thing you've said this morning." He didn't argue with it. The road was passable barely. The snow had compacted overnight under its own weight, and thunder moved through it with the careful dignity of a horse that had opinions about winter, but was too professional to act on them. Penelope's horse, a steady gray mare from Miles's own stable, followed without complaint. "I need you to tell me one thing before we get there," Penelope said, "if I can." "Is he a good man?" She asked it plainly without decoration. "Not a successful man, not a hard-working man, a good one." Miles was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own answer, and she heard it. "He's not a bad man," Miles said finally. "That's not what I asked." "I know." She faced forward again. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was processing something she didn't like but intended to handle regardless. "All right," she said. "All right." They didn't speak again until the first buildings of Fairplay came into view. Samuel Holloway was standing on the porch of the general store when they rode into town, talking to a woman in a green wool coat with dark hair and a laugh that carried. He was taller than Miles, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of easy, well-made handsomeness that gets a man a great deal of benefit of the doubt in life. He turned when he heard the horses, and his face did something complicated relief, and something under the relief that moved too fast for Penelope to catch. "Miles." He came off the porch in 2 steps. "God, I was starting to think—" He stopped when he saw Penelope. Looked at her for a moment. Then he took his hat off, which was at least the right gesture. "Miss Smith." "Mr. Holloway," Penelope said. She was looking at him with that same clear, cataloging attention she'd turned on Miles that morning, taking inventory. "You look—" Samuel started. "You look well, considering." "I am well," she said, "considering." An awkward beat of silence landed between all 3 of them. The woman in the green coat had come to stand near Samuel with the particular ease of someone accustomed to standing near him, and now she was looking at Penelope with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. Samuel cleared his throat. "This is Clara Marsh. She runs the millinery on 2nd Street." Clara Marsh smiled the smile of a woman doing the best she can in a situation nobody planned well. "Welcome to Fairplay, Miss Smith. I've heard a great deal about you." Penelope looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Samuel. "Have you—" Samuel's jaw moved. No sound came out. Miles, from somewhere slightly behind Penelope's left shoulder, said nothing, which was the only thing he could do, and arguably the most decent. "Perhaps," Penelope said in the voice she used when she had made a decision and was implementing it. "We could speak somewhere private, Mr. Holloway. The 3 of us." She did not look at Clara when she said 3. She looked only at Samuel, and the look made clear exactly which 3 she meant. Samuel glanced at Miles. Miles looked at the middle distance like it owed him money. "Yeah," Samuel said. "Yeah, of course. We can use the office at the land registry. It'll be empty this time of—" "The ranch," Penelope said. "I came here to see the ranch. Let's start there." She turned her horse east before he could answer. The ranch was good land, well kept. Even from the saddle, Penelope could see that much the fences were sound, the outbuildings maintained the general organization of it, suggesting a man who worked hard and knew what he was doing with his hands, even if other things were more complicated. She filed this away, the way she filed everything, as data neither good nor bad on its own, requiring context. Samuel showed her around with the stiff courtesy of a man walking through a conversation he'd been rehearsing and finding the rehearsal inadequate. He pointed out the cattle operation, the winter hay stores, the new well he'd dug the previous summer. He answered her questions, and she had questions specific and technical about water rights and grazing leases, and what he was paying for hay versus what he could reasonably produce on-site, with increasing surprise and decreasing condescension. The way men often moved through those two things, when a woman turned out to know more than they'd assumed. Miles stayed close but back. The particular distance of a man who is present because he needs to be and wishes he didn't. It was in the front room of the ranch house, looking at the ledger Samuel had left open on the desk, that Penelope stopped. She picked it up without asking. Samuel started to say something and stopped when he saw her face. She turned 3 pages, ran her finger down a column of figures, turned back to the previous page. Her brow creased in the particular way that meant she had found something, and the something was not good. "Who keeps your books?" she asked. "I've been doing them myself since February," Samuel said. "My last hand who handled accounts left for Denver. And before February, a man named Garrett, Gerald Garrett, he worked for me 2 years." She set the ledger down on the desk and placed both hands flat on either side of it, and looked at the numbers without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "Someone has been systematically undercounting your cattle sales and redirecting the difference." She moved her finger to a specific line. "See this entry: 40 heads sold to the Buford operation in September, but the payment recorded is for 32. That's the 3rd time in 8 months." She straightened. "Mr. Holloway, you have been robbed." Samuel stared at the ledger, then at her, then at the ledger again. "Gerald," he started. "Gerald Garrett was skimming your proceeds. Not a large amount at once, small enough to miss if you weren't looking carefully. Large enough to matter across 2 years. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "Here. And here. And this one in April is almost elegant. He's shifted the discrepancy across 3 separate line items, so it disappears in the column totals. It would have taken someone trained in account reconciliation to catch it." Miles from the doorway said nothing. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have time to read. Samuel put his hand over his mouth, looked at the numbers. "How much?" "I'd need a full afternoon with the books to give you a precise figure, but at a rough count." She scanned back 2 pages. "Somewhere north of $400. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man realizing something valuable has been taken from him, and he didn't notice. "I can do the full reconciliation," Penelope said. Her voice was even, professional. "If you want, it won't take more than a few hours." Samuel looked at her. The complicated thing was back on his face, and this time it stayed long enough for her to read it properly. It was guilt. Not guilt about the money. About something else. Something he'd been avoiding all morning. "Miss Smith," he said, "there's something I need to tell you." "I imagine there are several things," she said. He flinched. "Clara and we've been... It started before I knew when you'd be arriving, and then..." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't know how to write it in a letter." "You didn't write the letters," she said. The room went absolutely still. Samuel's eyes moved to Miles. Miles met the look with the stillness of a man who had known this was coming and had not found a way to prevent it. "Miss Smith," Samuel started. "Miles wrote them," she said. "I know that. I've known since this morning." Her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and only the set of her shoulders gave away the effort that steadiness cost her. What I did not know, what I am asking you now directly, is whether Miles also read mine. Another silence. This one was different. This one had weight to it. I don't read well, Samuel said, and to his credit, he said it without flinching. Never learned proper. Miles would, I'd bring him the letters and he read them to you, Penelope said. Yes. She turned to look at Miles. He was still in the doorway. He had not moved. He met her eyes with the same steadiness he'd offered her all morning, the steadiness of a man who has decided that whatever the cost is, he's going to pay it without looking away. Every letter, she said, not a question. Yes, Miles said. Something crossed her face, fast, tightly controlled, but real. Her hands on the ledger pressed flat for just a moment. She had written things in those letters. Private things. The kind of things a woman writes when she believes she is writing to one man. In the particular privacy of correspondence, her fears about the journey. Her doubts about her own courage. The admission in her 8th letter that she had spent the better part of an evening reading his words aloud to herself, to hear how they sounded spoken. The line she'd written in her 10th letter that still made her flush to think about, I find I have begun to miss someone I have never met, which is either evidence of imagination or evidence of something I am not yet ready to name. Miles had read that. Miles had read all of it. Had sat with Samuel Holloway and turned those pages and spoken her private words out loud in this room, or somewhere like it, and then had sat down and written back. She picked up the ledger, tucked it under her arm. I'm going to begin the reconciliation, she said. Her voice was perfectly level. It will take the afternoon. After that, Mr. Holloway, I expect a conversation, a real one, about where things stand between us. She looked at Samuel. Both of you. Samuel nodded, looking like a man who had expected a storm and found the quiet before it more frightening. She walked to the table in the corner, set the ledger down, pulled out the chair, and sat. She opened to the first page and began. Miles took one step into the room. Miss Smith. Not right now, Mr. Holloway. Her voice did not rise, did not waver. Right now, I am doing your cousin a service, and I would prefer to do it without additional information. He stopped, took a breath. All right. You can make coffee, she said. If you're going to stay. He went to make coffee. For the next hour, the only sounds in the room were the scratch of her pen, the occasional turn of a page, and the small, steady movements of Miles working at the stove. And if his eyes moved to her back more often than was strictly necessary, and if her pen paused once and then resumed with particular force, neither of them said anything about it. It was Samuel who broke it. He had been sitting at the far end of the table pretending to look at something, and now he set it down and said quietly, He didn't want to do it, you know. The letters. I had to ask him 3 times. Penelope did not look up from the ledger. He said it wasn't right. Samuel continued with the tone of a man who is both defending someone and condemning himself. Said it wasn't honest. I told him it was just practical, that I needed someone to handle the words because words weren't my strength. He paused. I think he agreed because he was curious about you, from the way I'd described you. Another pause, heavier. I don't think curiosity is what it stayed. The pen stopped. She sat very still for a moment. Then she turned a page and kept writing. The discrepancy in September, she said in a perfectly professional voice, is larger than I initially thought. You're looking closer to $460. I'll have the full accounting within the hour. Samuel closed his mouth. Miles at the stove had his back to both of them and did not turn around. The fire burned. The pen moved. The afternoon wore on towards something none of them had the words for yet, which was perhaps appropriate, given that the man in this story, who was best with words, was the one currently saying nothing at all. Then boots hit the porch outside, hard fast, the boots of someone moving with purpose, and the door opened without a knock, and a man Penelope didn't know stood in the frame with a face like bad weather and a piece of paper in his fist. Holloway, he said, looking at Samuel. We got a problem. The man's name was Walt Briggs, and he had worked Samuel's fence line for 3 years, which meant he was not a man who rattled easily. He was rattled now. He held out the paper, thick, official-looking, folded in thirds, with a wax seal along the edge, and Samuel took it with both hands, the way a man takes something he already knows is going to hurt him. "Found it nailed to the north pasture gate," Walt said. "There's another one on the barn door. Arrived this morning, best I can tell." Samuel stared at the document. His mouth moved slightly. Penelope was already out of her chair. "May I?" she said. Samuel handed it over without a word, which was the most honest acknowledgement he could have made about the limits of his reading, and she took it and spread it flat on the table and read it once quickly, and then read it again more slowly. "Gerald Garrett," she said. "What?" Samuel's head came up. "The claimant." She set her finger on the name at the top of the document. "Gerald Garrett, formerly of your employ, is filing a deed claim against 40 acres of your north pasture on the grounds of unpaid wages and an alleged verbal agreement made in the spring of 1874, granting him partial land rights in lieu of payment." She looked up. "He's giving you 72 hours to respond to the Park County Land Registry before the claim advances to the next stage." The silence that followed had a specific quality. The silence of a room where every person present is processing the same information at different speeds. Samuel said, "That's a lie." "I know," Penelope said. "There was no agreement. I know." She was already moving back to the ledger. "I know, because I spent the last hour with your books, Mr. Holloway, and what's in here is not the record of a man who failed to pay his help. What's in here is the record of a man who paid his help generously and consistently, while that same help was quietly taking more on the side." She turned to a specific page. "Garrett's wages are recorded accurately every month for 24 months, paid in full. What is not recorded, because Garrett was the one keeping the records, is what he took additionally." She set her pen down. "He's been stealing from you for 2 years. You have the evidence in this ledger to prove it, and now he has decided that the best defense is a very aggressive offense." Miles, who had not moved from near the stove, said, "He's trying to take the land before you can take him to court." "That is exactly what he's trying to do," Penelope said. "And he's filed in the right county with a real attorney's name on the bottom of that document, which means he has resources he did not have 2 years ago." She looked at Samuel. $460 will buy a reasonable amount of legal aggression in a county where the judges know everybody." Walt Briggs, who had been standing just inside the doorway, with the look of a man wanting very much to be somewhere less complicated, said, "There's something else." Everyone looked at him. He pulled a second piece of paper from his coat pocket, smaller than the first, folded once. "This one was tucked under the first. Don't have a seal on it. Wasn't meant to be official, I reckon. Was meant to be—" He stopped. "Read it yourself." Penelope took it, unfolded it, read 4 lines and set it on the table face down. "What does it say?" Miles asked. Her jaw was tight. "It says that Miss Smith would be wise to take the next coach back to Boston, as Colorado winters have proven fatal to newcomers who involve themselves in business that isn't theirs." The room went very quiet. Miles pushed off the wall he'd been leaning against and crossed the room in 4 steps and picked up the paper before anyone could say a word. He read it. His face did not change exactly, but something behind it did. Something shifted and went hard in a way that was quiet, and therefore considerably more serious than noise would have been. "Walt," he said in a conversational tone that did not match his face at all. "Who brought these to the property?" "Didn't see 'em delivered. Found 'em about 8 this morning." "Garrett know she was coming?" Samuel asked, looking at Penelope. "I don't see how he could," Miles said. "Unless someone in town talked." "Someone in town always talks," Penelope said. She was still standing at the table, her hands flat on the ledger, and she was looking at the official document, rather than at either of the men, which meant she was thinking. Miles had come to recognize this in the past 12 hours, the particular quality of her stillness when she was working through a problem. He had read her letters for a year, and heard that quality in the writing, in the way she'd approach a question from 3 different angles before committing to an answer, and here it was, in the flesh. And it was exactly the same, and it still stopped him short every time. "The note doesn't matter," she said. "It matters," Miles started. "It matters as evidence, and we'll keep it for that reason." She looked up. But as a threat, it doesn't matter. If Gerald Garrett wanted to frighten me away from this ledger, he has made an error in judgment about what kind of woman I am." She looked at Samuel. "We need to file a response at the land registry today. Not tomorrow. Today." She picked up the official document and read the bottom third again. "The 72 hours begins from the moment of posting. Walt, when do you think this was actually nailed to that gate?" Walt thought about it. "Snow was still coming down hard when I did the morning rounds at 6. It wasn't there at 6. I found it at 8. So filed this morning sometime between 6 and 8. She folded the document precisely. "That gives us until Thursday morning. But I don't want to wait until Thursday. I want to be at that registry before it closes today with a formal rebuttal and a documented accounting of Garrett's actual employment record, including the discrepancies I can demonstrate from these ledgers." She looked at Miles. "How long to ride back to town?" 20 minutes. "The registry closes at 4. He pulled out his watch. It was 1:30. "Plenty of time," he said. "Good." She was already sitting back down, pen in hand. "Give me 45 minutes to finish the reconciliation. I want numbers I can swear to, not estimates." Samuel said, "Miss Smith." "Mr. Holloway." She did not look up. "You can help me by finding me 2 more candles because this corner is poorly lit and by answering my questions when I ask them. Can you do that?" Samuel blinked. Then to his credit, he went and found the candles. Gee, she finished in 40 minutes. The numbers were not estimates. They were precise, cross-referenced, and documented against Garrett's own recorded entries in a way that made the fraud not merely provable, but obvious. The kind of obvious that holds up in a courtroom, because it requires no interpretation, only the ability to read a column of figures and notice when they don't match. She had also found something else. Something she hadn't expected buried in the March entries from 2 years back. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "did Garrett ever handle any transactions involving the North Pasture?" Samuel frowned. "He managed the lease renewal with the Birch Creek Grazing Cooperative. Why? Because there's an entry here from March of 1874, same month as the alleged verbal land agreement Garrett is claiming for a payment received from the Birch Creek Cooperative for seasonal grazing rights to the North Pasture." She turned the ledger toward him. "The amount received is recorded here as $60, but I've found 2 other references in Garrett's own notes, a draft letter and a payment slip tucked into the back cover that show the actual payment was $90. She pointed. "He pocketed $30 and recorded the lesser amount. And then in the same month, he apparently told you he had negotiated a land rights arrangement as part of his compensation." The room went still again. "He was using the North Pasture as his own collateral," Miles said slowly. "Leasing rights on land he didn't own, skimming the proceeds, and then building a paper trail to claim the land belonged to him." "That is my reading," Penelope said. "The draft letter is in his own handwriting. If we bring it to the registry along with the reconciliation, his claim falls apart. He can't assert a verbal land agreement from March 1874, when his own correspondence from that same month shows him acting as your agent on that land, not as a partial owner." Samuel sat back in his chair. He put both hands over his face for a moment. Then he took them down and said with the directness of a man finally running out of room for anything except honesty, "Miss Smith, I owe you an apology, several of them, truth be told. But right now I owe you thanks, and I don't quite have the words for either one." Penelope looked at him for a moment. The anger in her was still there. She hadn't let go of it and wasn't going to pretend she had. But it had settled into something more workable than the raw, scalding thing it had been that morning. "We'll talk, Mr. Holloway, after this is handled." He nodded. That was all. She stood, gathered the documents. The reconciliation she'd written, the draft letter, the payment slip, and the original ledger pages, and wrapped them in a piece of oilcloth from the supply shelf. "Ready," she said. Miles had their coats. The Park County Land Registry occupied the front half of a building that also housed the county assessor, and for reasons no one had ever adequately explained, a taxidermist. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man named Howell with a careful mustache, and the cautious eyes of someone who had recently developed opinions about who he wanted to see walk through his door. Penelope walked through his door and put the oilcloth package on the counter and said, "I'd like to file a rebuttal to the Garrett land claim against the Holloway North pasture. Reference number is at the top of the original filing which I have here." Howell looked at her, looked at Miles, who had come in behind her and was standing near the door with his hat in his hand and the particular stillness of a man prepared for things to go sideways. Looked back at Penelope. "Garrett claim," he said. "That was filed just this morning." "I'm aware. I'm filing the rebuttal this afternoon. Well within the response window." Howell picked up the original document she'd placed on the counter and looked at it with the expression of a man who had not expected to see it again so soon. "You'll need the property owner present to file a formal rebuttal. The property owner is aware of and consents to this filing," Penelope said. "I am acting as his authorized agent. I have a written authorization signed by Samuel Holloway dated today." She produced it. She had written it herself in the cabin before they left, and Samuel had signed it without argument. Colorado territory law permits a property owner to designate an agent for purposes of land registry filings. I believe you'll find the relevant statute in the 1871 Territorial Code section 14 paragraph 3. Howell stared at her. Miles very quietly from near the door said nothing, but his jaw moved slightly in a way that might in a different circumstance have been a smile. "I'm not certain that applies in a contested claim situation," Howell said. "Then I'd encourage you to look it up," Penelope said pleasantly. "I'm happy to wait." Howell looked at the document, looked at her, looked at the back room, which was where people looked when they wanted to check something with someone else before committing to an answer, and Penelope filed that look away with the same attention she gave to everything. "Who did you say you were?" Howell asked. "Penelope Smith, currently acting as accounting agent and legal representative for Samuel Holloway." She paused one beat. "I'm also the woman Gerald Garrett sent a threatening note to this morning, which I have retained as evidence of harassment and intimidation of a witness in a property dispute. That's a different matter, but one I intend to raise with the county judge at his earliest convenience." The room was quiet. Howell put the authorization letter down. He picked up his ledger. "I'll need to examine your supporting documents before accepting the filing." "Of course." She opened the oilcloth package and spread the contents on the counter with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who knows exactly what she has and is not afraid of anyone looking at it. He read in silence. A minute passed, then two. His expression changed as he went through the pages, not dramatically, but in the small, incremental way of a man adjusting his understanding of a situation he had believed was already settled. He reached the draft letter in Garrett's handwriting. "Read it twice." "This was found in the ranch ledger," he said. "In the back cover. In the handwriting of the man filing the claim describing himself as Mr. Holloway's agent in a transaction involving the North pasture land in March of 1874, the same month he is now claiming a verbal ownership agreement was made." She kept her voice even and precise. "An agent and an owner are different things, Mr. Howell. I think you'll find a judge would agree." Howell set the paper down. He picked up his pen. He began to write on the registration form with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided which way the wind is blowing. He was halfway through the form when the front door opened. Gerald Garrett walked in. He was a compact man with reddish hair going gray at the temples and the weathered look of someone who had spent years outdoors doing work they'd decided they were too good for. He stopped when he saw Penelope. His eyes moved to Miles. His expression went through several things, quickly settling finally on something that was trying to be confidence and not quite making it. "Howell," he said, not looking away from Miles. "What's happening here, Mr. Garrett?" Howell kept writing. "Miss Smith is filing a rebuttal to your claim, on behalf of Mr. Holloway." Garrett's eyes moved to the counter, to the document spread across it. He took 2 steps forward and reached for the ledger. Miles moved. Not aggressively, he simply stepped between Garrett and the counter, which required no particular drama because he was already close enough that it only took 1 step. He didn't touch Garrett, he just stood there at a distance that made his point without making a scene. That's evidence in a legal filing, Miles said. I wouldn't. Garrett looked up at him. Something passed between them, old and complicated, the particular tension of two men who have dealt with each other long enough to know exactly where the edges are. You got no business in this Holloway, Garrett said. Miss Smith is my business, Miles said. Penelope, who was watching this from the other side of the counter, heard it, heard the particular weight of those 4 words, the way they weren't qualified or explained, just stated as plainly as a man states a fact he's certain of, and felt something move through her chest that she did not have time to examine. The filing is complete, Howell said. He turned the registration form around on the counter and pressed it toward Penelope. She read it, checked the numbers against her own documentation, and signed her name at the bottom, the clean, certain signature of a woman who has decided something. Garrett was still looking at Miles. This isn't done, he said. No, Miles agreed. It isn't, but it started. He reached past Garrett, picked up Penelope's oilcloth package from the counter, and handed it to her without looking away from Garrett's face. We'll be in touch through the county judge's office. I expect you'll be hearing from him shortly. Penelope tucked the package under her arm, nodded once to Howell, and walked to the door. She pushed it open and stepped into the cold afternoon air and kept walking until she'd put 20 feet between herself and the registry building, and then she stopped and stood still for a moment and breathed. Miles came out behind her. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold, and waited. He's going to fight it, she said. Yes. He has money, Garrett's money, the money he took from Samuel. Yes. She turned to look at him. That note he sent, the threat. Miles looked at her steadily. I know. He's not going to stop because we filed a piece of paper. No, Miles said. He's not. She held his gaze for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the snow on the street, turning it gold and pale blue at the edges, and she was not looking at the snow. She was looking at him, and he was looking at her. And the 12 months of letters, and the blizzard, and the morning in the cabin, and the hour at the ledger, and the look on his face when he'd said, Miss Smith is my business, all settled into the space between them, like a weight finding its level. Miles, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without a preceding Mr., and she heard it land, and she watched him hear it. Yeah, he said quietly. We need to talk. I know. Not here. No. He looked down the street toward where the horses were tied, then back at her. I know a place, if you trust me. She looked at him for one long, honest moment. You rode into a blizzard to find me, she said. You sat up all night. You told the truth when lying would have been easier. She pulled her coat tighter. I think I can trust you with the location of a conversation. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, just at the edges, the particular shift of a man who has been braced against something and is allowing himself for the first time to stop. Come on then, he said, and she fell into step beside him. And the gold light held, and behind them inside the registry building, Gerald Garrett was staring at a signed document that was going to make his next several weeks very difficult. And none of that mattered as much in this particular moment as the fact that their shoulders were almost touching as they walked. The place Miles had in mind turned out to be the back room of a small building at the edge of Fairplay's main street, not a saloon, not a hotel lobby, but a quiet office that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, belonging to a retired circuit judge named Abner Coles, who had the reputation of being the most relentlessly fair man in Park County, which was why Miles trusted him and why Garrett Penelope suspected had not gone to him first. Judge Coles was 73 years old, with a white beard, and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough of human nature to find it more interesting than alarming. He listened to Miles's explanation of the situation without interrupting. And then he looked at Penelope's documentation with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades reading what was real and what was constructed to look real. Garrett's claim was filed with Harold Beeson, the judge said when he'd finished reading. Yes, sir, Miles said. Beeson is Gerald Garrett's brother-in-law. A beat of silence. I wasn't aware of that, Miles said. Penelope was already reaching for the signed registry form in her oilcloth package. The rebuttal was accepted by a clerk named Howell, not Beeson. She set it on the judge's desk. I filed it 40 minutes ago. The judge looked in the form. Something in his expression shifted just slightly in the way of a man confirming what he already suspected. Howell's a decent man, he said. He'll have logged it correctly. He set the form down and folded his hands. Miss Smith, you did this work yourself. The reconciliation. I did. In an afternoon. I've been keeping accounts since I was 17, Judge. 2 firms in Boston over 8 years. I know what fraud looks like when I see it. He studied her for a moment with the particular attention of someone calibrating. Then he nodded once, with the finality of a man who has made a judgment he's comfortable with. Leave the documentation with me. I'll have a summons drawn for Garrett by tomorrow morning. He looked at Miles. You'll want to be careful tonight. Garrett knows the rebuttal was filed. Men who've been caught sometimes make poor decisions. Yes, sir, Miles said. I know. They stepped back out into the cold, and Penelope stopped walking and stood still, and Miles stopped beside her and waited because he had come to understand in the past 12 hours that her stillnesses were not empty. They were full of something that had not yet decided how to arrange itself into words. Now, she said. Can we talk? Yes, he said. There was a bench on the far side of the building out of the wind, and they sat on it with 6 inches of cold wood between them and the whole of Fairplay going about its business 20 yards away, indifferent to the fact that 2 people were sitting in the particular silence of a moment they'd been building toward for a year. Tell me the truth, Penelope said. About all of it, from the beginning. Miles looked at his hands. Samuel came to me in January of last year. He'd been corresponding with a marriage agency in Denver. He'd placed a notice, gotten a few responses. Your letter was different from the others. He paused. He brought it to me to read aloud the way he always did with written things, and then he asked me to write back. And you did. I told him I shouldn't. That it wasn't right, that a woman deserved to know who she was actually writing to. He said it was practical, that the words didn't matter, only the arrangement. He stopped. I didn't agree with that, but I wrote the first letter. I kept it. I tried to keep it factual. The ranch, the land, what to expect. The practical things. And then I wrote back, Penelope said. And then you wrote back. He was quiet for a moment. Your first letter asked me about the accounting systems, about whether the ranch was financially sound, what the debt structure looked like, whether the water rights were secure. Every other letter Samuel received from that agency was about domestic arrangements. You asked about solvency. Despite everything, something shifted in her face toward Rye. I wanted to know what I was walking into. I know. I could tell. And He stopped again. Found the word. I answered honestly. More honestly than I'd intended to. And then your next letter answered my answers and raised 3 more questions, and I found myself writing back before I'd properly decided to. He looked at her. By the 3rd letter, I knew I was in trouble. Why didn't you stop? I tried. I told Samuel I thought we should come clean. That you deserved to correspond with the actual man you'd be marrying. He looked at his hands again. He said if I stopped, he'd find someone else to do it, and that person wouldn't care about getting it right. Penelope was quiet, listening. That was probably the least honest thing I told myself, Miles said. Because the truth is, I kept writing because I couldn't stop. Because every letter you sent was because you were exactly the way you wrote, and I had never... He stopped. Pressed his mouth shut for a moment. Then, I had no right to feel what I felt. I knew that. I wrote the letters, and I read yours to Samuel, and I told myself the whole time it was a practical arrangement I was facilitating, and every word of that was a lie I was telling myself, because the truth was too inconvenient. The wind moved between them. Down the street someone laughed. A horse stamped. When Samuel told me you were coming, Miles said, when I saw the arrival date, I was relieved. I thought it ends there. She arrives, she meets him. It becomes what it was supposed to be all along, and I go back to my ranch, and that's the end of it." He looked at her directly. "And then the stage didn't come. And I wrote out. And I found you." Penelope met his eyes, held them. "Miles," she said. "Did you love me through those letters? Not what you thought I was. Did you love what I actually was?" He didn't look away. "Yes," he said. "I did. I do." The word do landed between them and stayed. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I wrote in my 10th letter." "I know what you wrote." "Then you know what I was saying." Her voice was very quiet. "I was saying it to a man I thought was Samuel Holloway, but the voice I was saying it to, that was yours." "Yes." "And the man I was falling in love with was me," he said, "which I had no right to let happen." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She paused. "And yet, here we are." The bench held them both, and the cold held the street, and the silence held everything that came next, without quite letting it go yet. "There's still Samuel," she said. "I know. I came here to marry him." "I know that too." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them. "He doesn't want to marry me. He's in love with Clara Marsh." That was obvious before he opened his mouth. She paused. "Was that part of the reason you kept writing, that he didn't actually want?" "I didn't know about Clara until 6 weeks ago," Miles said. "And I didn't know what to do with it. Samuel kept saying he'd sort it out, that it would work." He pressed his jaw. "I should have written to you immediately when I found out. That was wrong. Whatever else I've done wrong, that one was the clearest." She nodded slowly. "Yes, it was." "I'm sorry, Penelope." It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it move through her, the same way his had moved through him earlier, recognized, claimed real. "I know you are," she said. The sound of boots on the frozen ground came fast and deliberate, and they both looked up to find Samuel Holloway coming toward them with the look of a man who has spent the last hour making a decision he should have made 6 weeks ago and is now committed to the discomfort of it. He stopped in front of them, took his hat off. "I owe you more than an apology," he said to Penelope. "I know that. I behaved poorly from the start of it, and worse as it went on, and I don't have an excuse that would hold up to any kind of examination." He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man doing the right thing later than he should have, but doing it properly now. "The arrangement, the agreement we made, I'm releasing you from it. Completely. No obligation. You came all this way, and I treated you like a problem to be solved rather than a person, and I'm sorry for it." Penelope looked at him for a long moment. "Are you going to marry Clara Marsh?" He blinked. Then, "I intend to ask her." "Does she know about the land dispute?" "She will by tonight." "Good." Penelope stood smoothing her skirt with the particular composure of a woman closing a chapter. "She deserves to know what she's marrying into, including the financial situation, which I would recommend you resolve with a proper accountant before the wedding." She paused. "I'll leave the reconciliation with you. The documentation for the judge is already filed. The rest is yours to manage." Samuel nodded. He looked at Miles. Something passed between them, old, complicated, too deep for the moment to hold entirely. "You're a better man than me," Samuel said. "You always were." Miles said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. Samuel put his hat back on and walked away down the street, and the whole long, complicated shape of what he'd been in both their lives walked with him and got smaller, and finally turned the corner and was gone. The quiet that followed was different from the one before, cleaner, like air after rain. "Well," Penelope said. "Well," Miles said. She turned to look at him, and he looked back, and neither of them pretended not to know where things stood. "I need to go back to Boston," she said. "I don't mean permanently, I mean my things are there. My work, such as it is. I have a lease on a room through March. I'd need to—" She stopped. "I'm telling you the practical considerations." "I noticed. It's how I think." "I know. I've read your letters." Something in his face moved toward warmth. You wrote in your fourth letter that you approach emotional situations the way you approach ledgers, look for where things balance and where they don't, because the truth is always in the discrepancy. She stared at him. I'd forgotten I wrote that. I hadn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Miles, what are you asking me? He stood up from the bench. He was taller than she'd fully registered before she'd registered it. Of course, she'd registered everything. But standing here now with the cold light on his face and his hat in his hands and all the pretense of the morning burned away, she registered it differently. He stood the way he did everything fully present, no performance, just the plain fact of himself. I'm asking you, he said carefully, whether you'd be willing to write to me while you're settling things in Boston. The way we've been writing, except this time with my name on the letters. She held his gaze. Your name. Mine, not Samuel's. Mine. He paused. And if after a few months of that, you find that what you thought you felt is still there, I'd like to come to Boston. Or meet you somewhere between. Or... He stopped. I'm doing this badly. You're doing it honestly, she said. That's better. I thought you might say that, he said, and something in his voice was warmer than the words. She took one step toward him, then another. She was close enough now that she had to look up slightly to see his face. And she did look directly without the armor of composure, with the particular vulnerability of a woman who has decided to let herself be fully seen by someone who has already seen everything she's ever written. In my 10th letter, she said quietly, I wrote that I find I have begun to miss someone I have never met, which is either evidence of imagination or evidence of something I am not yet ready to name. Yes, he said, very quiet. I'm ready to name it now. He didn't move. He let her come to it in her own time, the way he'd let her come to everything, without pushing, without pulling, just present and certain and there. I will write to you, she said, with your name on the envelope, and I expect you to write back with the same honesty you put in every letter you ever sent, because I will know the difference and I will call you on it. She held out her hand, not for sentiment, but the firm, deliberate handshake of a woman entering an agreement she intends to honor. Deal. He looked at her hand. Then he took it and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required, just long enough to mean something, not long enough to say more than she'd invited him to say. Deal, he said. She didn't pull her hand back immediately. He didn't release it immediately. The cold pressed around them, and the town moved, and the judge 3 buildings over was already drawing up a summons that would put Gerald Garrett in front of a jury before the spring thaw. And none of that touched this moment, this small and enormous moment, which belonged only to the two of them. Then, boots hit the frozen ground again, running this time, and from the wrong direction. It was Walt Briggs breathing hard, his face stripped down to something urgent. Miss Smith, Miles. He pulled up short in front of them. Garrett's gone to Beeson directly. Beeson's calling the rebuttal filing improper on grounds that an agent's signature ain't valid in a contested claim. He's trying to have it voided before the judge gets the summons. Penelope dropped Miles's hand, turned to Walt with full attention. Is Beeson still at the registry building? Was 2 minutes ago. Then so am I, she said. She was already moving her coat, snapping in the wind, her stride the stride of a woman who has been underestimated before and has learned to move fast enough to make it an advantage. Miles fell into step beside her. Section 14, she said, not breaking stride. Paragraph 3, he said. I have the territorial code citation in my coat pocket. I wrote it down before we left your ranch. She glanced at him sideways. I was a bookkeeper for 8 years, Miles. I always bring the documentation. He was smiling, properly fully the smile of a man who has stopped pretending he isn't. Yes, ma'am, he said. They walked through to the door of the land registry side by side, and Harold Beeson looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a man who had believed his afternoon was going to go a certain way, and was now being rapidly revised of that belief, and Gerald Garrett, standing at the counter with his hat in his hand, and his case prepared, turned around and saw them, and went very still. Penelope set her oilcloth package on the counter, looked Beeson directly in the eye and said, "I'd like you to show me specifically which provision of Colorado territorial law you're using to void this filing, in writing. Because I intend to have Judge Coles review your reasoning before close of business, and I want to make sure I've represented your position accurately." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who does not have an answer because there is not one. Gerald Garrett left the building 11 minutes later without a word. Harold Beeson logged the rebuttal filing correctly and permanently at 3:47 in the afternoon. Judge Coles issued the summons before sundown. And Penelope Smith, standing at the counter of the Park County Land Registry, with ink drying on the official record, and Miles Holloway beside her, and her own name signed at the bottom of a document that would hold up in every court in the territory, felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who came 2,000 miles in a blizzard, lost everything she thought she was coming for, and found something truer, waiting in the cold on the other side. She had not come to Colorado to be rescued. She had come to build a life, and she had built the first wall of it that afternoon with numbers in ink, and the stubborn refusal to be frightened off by a man who had mistaken her for someone who could be. Miles walked her out. The sun was going down behind the mountains, turning the snow every color it could find before the dark took over. "Boston," he said. "March," she said. "I'll be back by March if the passes cooperate. And if they don't," she looked up at him, "then I'll walk." He believed her completely. 3 months later, on a morning in early March, when the first real warmth of the year was beginning to find its way through the Colorado cold, a letter arrived at Miles Holloway's ranch with a Boston postmark and his name on the envelope, his name Miles written in the careful, certain hand he had memorized over 12 months of correspondence and one extraordinary winter. He read it standing at the door without going inside, with Thunder watching from the fence and Tim pretending not to watch from the barn. And the letter said what he'd hoped it would say, and more than he'd let himself expect, and he sat down on the porch step and read it twice, and then a third time, and then he went inside to write back. The stagecoach from Denver arrived in Fairplay 6 weeks after that, on a clear April afternoon with no storm in sight, and Penelope Smith stepped off it with her trunk and her ledger case, and the collected composure of a woman who has crossed this particular distance before and knows exactly what is waiting at the end of it. Miles was there. He had been there since noon, which was 3 hours early. A fact he did not mention, and Tim would never stop mentioning. She saw him before he saw her, and she stood still for one moment and let herself have it, the whole of it, the year of letters and the blizzard and the long winter and the longer spring, and the particular face of the man who had ridden into a storm to find her, and had been honest with her, even when honesty cost him something. And then she picked up her case and walked toward him, and he walked toward her, and they met in the middle, which was where they had always been headed. Whatever the Colorado winters brought after that, and they brought plenty, because the mountains have no patience for easy lives. Miles and Penelope Holloway faced them the way they faced everything side by side, with the books balanced, the truth told, and not a single letter between them left unanswered.